So, but yeah, if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. So we're just primarily, I'm going to focus and do an overview on Title I, Part A. But before we dive into Title I, just bringing to the forefront ESEA. So ESEA is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was first enacted in 1965 with that goal to reduce achievement gaps by providing all children with fair and equitable education. So ESEA itself includes numerous educational programs and in fact has a total of 10 titles, of which Title I is, of course, a part of it. And then within Title I itself, there are numerous subparts, but today we're really going to focus on Title I, Part A. And ultimately, the intent and focus of Title I, Part A is to target funds into high poverty school districts so that those funds can be used to provide supplemental education for students who are educationally disadvantaged or who are at risk of failing behind their peers and failing to meet the state standards. So you want to go ahead and go to the next one. So the allocation of funds to LEAs, let's see. So the formula to allocate funds to LEAs under Title I has two primary elements, of which there is the state's average per pupil expenditure and then the count of children from low-income families across the entire state of Wisconsin. And this is all based off of U.S. Census data, and it's referred to as SAPE, or the Small Area Income and Poverty Estimates. So this is what's used to support the calculation first with what we as a state receive under Title I, and then it breaks down further as to what individual LEA, what an individual LEA receives in regards to Title I-A funding. For independent charter schools, the allocation is going to be calculated off of poverty counts of students by district using each student's resident district's poverty percentage, since the LEA or since an ICS isn't like a standard LEA where there are those established boundary areas. Yep. So this is one of those fun slides, Alex, where there's a lot of little clicks. So an LEA's taking it next to the next level. So we talked about, the state's allocation, but looking at allocating funds to LEAs. An LEA's Title I allocation is based, again, on that state census data and consists of 4 separate funding streams. So there's basic, targeted, financial incentive, and concentration. So you see those at the top of this grid. If an LEA has at least 10 children identified as being in poverty, and that number is at least 2% or greater of the LEA's total student population, then that LEA is going to be eligible for a basic grant or essentially be eligible for that basic funding stream. And then we have the targeted and financial incentive. And this is where if an LEA has students with at least those 10% in poverty and the number of children in poverty is at least 5% of their school-aged population, they're going to be eligible all of a sudden for 2 additional funding streams, and that would be targeted in financial incentive. So what happens potentially is if an LEA teeters between that 5% every year, so one year they're right below 5%, they might see a decrease in their allocation because they're going to have gone from receiving targeted and financial incentive funding streams to just going back to receiving only that basic. In the same sense, if all of a sudden their poverty percentage would go just above that 5%, they would then be eligible again for that targeted and that financial incentive funding stream. So they're going to see a pretty significant increase to their Title I allocation. So that is one of those things where if an LEA is, pretty close to that 5%, there could be between years a significant decrease or a significant increase. And then finally, the last one that we're looking at is that 15%, kind of that threshold. And this opens up a whole nother funding stream referred to the concentration grant or the concentration funding stream. And this likewise has kind of that same sort of effect with that 5% threshold, where if an LEA teeters around that 15%, they could go between having 3 funding streams one year to all of a sudden having 4 funding streams where they would see a significant increase. Or if they were to decrease below that 15%, all of a sudden they would be back down to only receiving 3 funding streams. Regardless of the number of funding streams that an LEA or that makes up an LEA's Title I allocation, an LEA is actually still only going to receive 1 Title I allocation. So that's something to keep in mind. This is more so just to kind of, I guess, for your information, because you might see references to equitable participation and technical assistance. You might hear of it, and you might also see it in WISE grants in some shape or form. And so this is ultimately to let you know that under ESEA, and actually under IDEA as well, there are provisions that require an LEA to provide equitable services to private school children that attend a private school that's located within the LEA's boundaries. So these provisions, which are often referred to as equitable participation or equitable services, are required under each of the title formula grants. So if we think about that, like the big four titles. So of course, Title I Part A, Title II Part A, Title III Part A, and Title IV Part A are kind of what we refer to as the big title grants. As I mentioned earlier, since ICSs do not have those geographical boundaries, there's not going to be any equitable participation requirements for charter schools. And again, this is just for your information, because more than likely you will see the term equitable participation come up, whether in WISE grants or technical assistance that you might look at. When it comes to reservations, LEAs have the option to take some funds off the top, or you can also look at it of setting some funds aside off of the top of the allocation to support certain initiatives. And this would be before making a per pupil amount allocation at the school level. Some of these reservations are potentially required, and we'll go into that on the next screen. Other reservations, and we'll definitely talk about that too, are optional and are completely at the discretion of the LEA. So the one reservation that is unilaterally required is the homeless reservation. So this reservation is required so that LEAs are able to provide equitable services to their students who have been identified as experiencing homelessness. Services can be provided at any time during the year, and ultimately this is meant to ensure that these students have, that they are receiving, first off, supports within their education, but also, the funds can be used to support any sort of barriers that might impede their education, as far as even getting transportation to and from school, school supplies. There's a lot of flexibility on how those funds can be used to support those students who are experiencing homelessness. The family engagement reservation is one that's interesting, because if an LEA has an allocation that is greater or is equal to or greater than $500,000 under Title I, then it is a required allocation. And in that scenario, at least 1% of the allocation must go towards family engagement activities. It doesn't mean in that situation that an LEA couldn't say, oh, well, we're going to set aside more money than just this 1%. That is certainly an option, but at least 1% of the allocation in this instant has to go towards family engagement. And then that leads to our optional reservations, again, or those reservations that, you know, are at the discretion of the LEAs. So for LEAs who have an allocation less than $500,000, and I apologize for the typo on that 500,000, family engagement does become an optional reservation. We also have things like administrative costs, whether it is direct or indirect. So there's the ability to do direct administrative costs, and that's essentially the name of that reservation. There's also on the reservation screen the ability to indicate that your ICS wants to recoup some indirect costs are associated with maintaining the grant and supporting the programming. Centralized services. So if you're a multiple charter school, this would be something that might be applicable. So if an individual or, you know, services are applied to more than one school building, there's the ability to basically kind of set that aside and indicate that those services are being utilized across the district or across the charter school. Professional development services to specific student groups. So in particular, there are reservations to support student groups such as students in out-of-home care, neglected and delinquent institutions, or students who have migratory status. And then LEAs who do have certain federal identifications, such as TSI or CSI, do have the ability to set aside funds for financial resources or incentives to support the hiring and maintaining of staff. So then when it comes to actually allocating funds to schools within the district, school building eligibility is going to be determined through a ranking process that's based on poverty within each school building. So for most independent charter schools that do consist of a single school, that ranking is ultimately considered a formality. It's part of the standard application. And so when you assign your per pupil amount, that just ultimately identifies the allocation amount that goes to your one single school. And again, it's determined by simply dividing the available funds by the number of students who are identified as experiencing low income enrollment. So it's more of a formality in most instances for charter schools. And then that does lead into when you're looking then at your school and your student population, who are your Title I eligible students? And the first thing you need to look at is what sort of status do you have when it comes to Title I? Does your school have the targeted assistance status, or does it have a school-wide status? Because ultimately that's going to affect what your Title I eligible students look like. So within targeted assistance, your Title I students have to be identified through a multi-step process. And the other thing to keep in mind is there's not that association between whether or not a student is low income and then that they're eligible for services. So low income and poverty data is used to support determining funding, but it has nothing to do with whether or not a student would be deemed eligible for services. So ultimately, there has to be the process of using multiple academic measures to identify eligible students, and then identifying your students who really are most at risk of failing to meet those state academic standards. And then ranking those students, and then, you know, seeing what and how many students the funds can ultimately support. When it comes to school-wide, all students are technically Title I students. So schools are not required to rank their students for services. And ultimately, school-wide does allow this LEA to upgrade the educational program for all of the students within the building. And while they can certainly then utilize funding to lean in and address the barriers and the areas of greatest need for those lowest achieving students, they can do that, but then also focus on improving academic for all students within the school. And this idea of targeted assistance and school-wide also is important to keep in mind as far as how your Title I funds can be used. So what's considered an allowable cost. It also really connects back to what's really a need and how does that relate. Something when we're reviewing budgets, you might hear your Title I consultant push back and ask, well, I might have concerns about this being allowable. Or even if it's allowable, is it reasonable? Is it necessary? How does it fit in with your students' needs? How does it fit in with your school-wide plan? So there's a whole bunch of things to consider. For Title I schools that have a targeted assistance program, the budgeted items need to always address the needs of your eligible Title I students, their families, and their educators. So again, after you've identified the students that are going to receive the services, we would expect to see those costs directly associate with the services that they are receiving. And then for school-wide programs, budget items should support the comprehensive improvement efforts for that school-wide plan, because all students in a school-wide program are eligible to receive services. There is sometimes going to be more flexibility on how those funds can be used, and we might see more broad uses of the Title I funds, but it should always harken back to that school-wide plan. So this might make it still a little ambiguous as to what would be a Title I allowable cost. So first and foremost, how does the proposed budget item address the need of your Title I students, whether it's targeted assistance or school-wide? And then second, does the cost adhere to the Uniform Grant Guidance, EDGAR, and the LEA policies? So the Uniform Grant Guidance is the federal guidance that applies to all federal grants. EDGAR is the grant regulations that are specific to all USDE grants. So that would, of course, apply to all of the ESEA grants and not just Title I. And then it also the cost does have to align with your own LEA policies. The LEA is also required to have written procedures to determine the allowability of cost. And those procedures need to include a step for the LEA to ensure that your school is still receiving its full share of state and local funds. Ultimately, the LEA, again, just needs to make sure that that proposed budget item is really addressing the needs of the Title I students. And then there is that allowability checklist available too, that does offer more parameters as far as what we would typically see Title I funds going towards. So Title I allocations are aligned to the state's fiscal year. This means that the grant's obligation period begins on July 1st and ends on June 30th. So if we were to look at FY24 as an example, it started on July 1st of 2023 and is going to go through June 30th of 2024. And then any grant funds that are not spent within the fiscal year that the funds are awarded may potentially be carried over into the next fiscal year, depending on the size of the LEA's allocation. So Title I has a specific requirement or a carryover limitation requirement, where districts that receive a Title I allocation less than $50,000, they are allowed to carry over any of their remaining funds. A district with an allocation of $50,000 or greater, however, can only carry over 15% of the total allocation. So that's where, like I said, it depends. And that image on the slide is a really good example of that. It's important to know that when we talk about carrying over funds and when we talk about the allocation amount, if your ICS does make use of a flexibility referred to as ESEA transferability, where you transfer any Title II or Title IV funds into Title I, those funds become part of your Title I allocation. So if you were below that $50,000 threshold, but you transferred over Title II funds, and now all of a sudden you're above that $50,000 threshold, that would adjust how, you know, your eligibility around carrying over funds. So here is just some technical assistance that's really helpful for some of the more introductory level topics related to Title I. The Title I shorts are ultimately about 5-minute videos that cover a slew of topics, from things like collecting enrollment data to even there's one for targeted assistance programming, school-wide programming, family engagement. So there definitely is quite the extensive library of topics. Then on our DPI's Title I website, we do have all of our Title I resources available there as well. So I don't know if there's any questions. I'll pull up the chat. I'm not seeing any. I was worried about time, but I might have gone too fast.
No, that's perfectly fine.
I also just realized I never introduced myself. I'm really sorry about that. My name is Brielle Glatzel. I know Sarah at least introduced my first name. I am a federal fiscal monitoring consultant. I am also a Title I consultant, so I do review Title I applications. I do not review applications for the ICSs. That will be Josie Smith, who I believe is, I'm scrolling.
I'm here.
She's
Hey,
here.
Brielle.
Hey. So Josie is here. So she will be, I believe, reviewing all of the ICSs. Yes, yeah. So, but yeah, so if there's any questions, I think we have a minute or two, but otherwise.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
We appreciate you stopping in and shaving off 5 minutes. That's always nice when people go under and not over.
Yeah.
So if anyone has any questions, please chime in. Otherwise, I'm gonna let Brielle go.
Perfect. Alex, I did add to the slide because I realized that, you know, I always mean to connect with you because I always dive into Title I because obviously that's my kind of my security blanket area. Between 30 or there's now a new slide. So if individuals attending this do get access to the slides, there is a new slide that is just like a general image and summary of each of the individual main 4 titles. So it gives like a nice little summary of what the intent and purposes are of Title I, II, III, and IV. And then when included within that is a nice little snippet of what we typically would assume are the allowable cost or the primary areas of how those funds can be used. So that is now included on the slides too, because I thought that still might be helpful.
Perfect. We will make sure that everyone gets those.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
We do have one question in the chat. And it's probably for Alex, actually. Will we cover today requirements for student enrollment and count day reporting?
Yes, I will talk about what goes on the count reports at the end. You're going to have to
Okay.
wait around until 2:15 to hear my my discussion of that. It's relatively simple to do, so you know, it shouldn't take too long.
Okay, great. And I am watching the list for Courtney to jump on. We have a couple other people joining as well. So welcome to everybody who's just joining.
While we wait for Courtney, I will touch on the count report just a little bit to say that the chunk of documents that usually come out at the end of July will be coming out either on Friday if it's the program calendar, and next week if it's the payment letter and things like that. So you have that to look forward to. That is going to be on our I don't know why my video isn't on. I can just start it so you can actually see me talk. It's going to be on our webpage, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end if you're new or if you need a refresher. We keep a lot of great documents on our ICS webpage, including the payment letter, which explains, you know, how you're going to calculate where these students come from, and or not calculate where they come from, but how you're going to determine what their resident district is. And as Brielle alluded to, we use that information for title purposes. So it's really absolutely very important that you get it right the first time, because if you don't get it right the first time, then someone has to go back and fix it on how we report it to the title team, and that someone is me. And it's very long and tedious, and it requires a lot of eye drops, and so in spreadsheets, and so it's going to be real important that you do that right the first time. But I'm going to resend this link to Courtney just so she has it, and we should get rock and roll in just a second.
She just jumped on.
Perfect.
Give her a minute to connect and then we should be set. Yes.
Okay.
Courtney, welcome. I think we're ready for you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you. Do you want me just to go ahead and jump right in?
Yeah, so Courtney, I've got your slides. Everyone can see them. I'm pretty good about knowing when to click to the next one, but if I'm not doing it properly, just, you know, give me a kick in the shin and I'll be sure to move along to the next one.
Perfect. That sounds great. So first of all, I'm so glad to see everyone here today, and it's a pleasure to join with you. I typically would have my camera on. I just had emergency eye surgery on Tuesday night, so I'm still working with some accommodations and patch and low light. So we're gonna go with no camera this morning, and I'm here along with Patrick Chambers and also representing another team here at DPI to talk through a series of data analyses that the state education agencies across the country do as it relates to two federal laws, and therefore they do attach to charter schools. So my name is Courtney Reed Jenkins. I'm on the special education team here at the Department of Public Instruction, and I'm joined by Patrick Chambers, who's from the Office of Educational Accountability. And finally, we work closely with a team called Title I Continuous Improvement to make sure that all local education agencies in Wisconsin have data that they can use to drive continuous improvement and improve outcomes for kids. So with that, if you can go to the next slide, please. Alex, so I'm going to go through the two federal laws that we are going to focus on in our presentation today, and that is the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act and the Every Student Succeeds Act. These are the two largest federal laws that invest in schools at the local level. Under IDEA, the goal is to provide students with disabilities a free, appropriate public education. And the goal under the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, is to enhance outcomes for all students. And while it doesn't matter for charter schools, I just did want to flag that the reports are at different levels under those two laws. IDEA looks at district level data and ESSA looks at school level data. But as it relates to charter schools, because you're LEAs, IDEA looks at school level data for purposes of charter schools in making what is called LEA determinations. So every year, the federal government asks states to collect and analyze data around students with disabilities and identify every LEA in the state in one of four categories. So it's meeting requirements under the law, needing assistance, needing intervention, or needing substantial intervention. And each of those categories, the last three categories, carry specific requirements under federal law that do attach to charter schools. And the second identification that occurs under the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act is that the racial equity in special education reports looks at racial disproportionality in special ed identification, discipline, and placement. And if there is racial disproportionality, there are, again, required actions as well as a reservation of funds. And as it relates to identifications under ESSA, there are an identification that is the Comprehensive Support and Improvement, which identifies schools in the bottom 5% of the state. And then there is a data analysis that looks at gaps between student subgroups, and it may result in an identification known as targeted support and improvement or additional targeted support and improvement. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. And Patrick, do you want to cover ESSA?
Yep, thanks, Courtney. And hello again, everyone. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, I hope you can hear me. I think I've resolved my Zoom issues. If not, Courtney's just gonna take over. So I won't subject you to the pain of listening to my choppy connection again, and thanks again.
You sound a lot better, Patrick.
Oh, thank God, thank goodness. Great, so I'm gonna talk about ESSA. As Courtney mentioned, there are three identifications, kind of ranging from least severe to most severe. The first one is TSI. These identifications take place annually. And a TSI identification identifies the low performing student groups within a school. And that's defined by that student group performing in the bottom 10% of overall performance and bottom 10% of student groups. The next type of identification is ATSI, which is additional targeted support and improvement. Unlike TSI, this identification takes place every 3 years. It is considered more severe than TSI. Again, it's another lowest performing student group at a school type identification. It's essentially the same thing as TSI, but instead of being the bottom 5%, instead of being in the bottom 10%, it falls below essentially the bottom 5%. And then finally, the most severe type of SI identification is CSI, Comprehensive Support and Improvement. Again, this another identification that takes place every 3 years. There are two types of CSI identification. The first is CSI lowest performance, and that's in which a school places in the bottom 5% of Title I schools. There's also the CSI low graduation rate. And these are schools that have a graduation rate that is below 67%. We can go to the next slide, please. So in terms of how this accountability system works, the data are submitted to DPI. Our team kind of prepares the data, so to speak, to run it through this ESSA accountability system. Similar to the report cards, there are different indicators. For ESSA, there's achievement, growth, graduation, absenteeism, and ELP progress. And I'll talk a little bit more about these on the next slide. You've kind of put all these indicators together to form what is called a summary score. And ultimately, the identifications are made based on the performance of those summary scores and the kind of percentile ranks for the schools and the student groups. We go to, thank you, Alex. So I mentioned the 5 different types of ESSA indicators. Obviously, some schools will not have all of these indicators, but when that happens, things get reweighted. But the first is achievement, which is based on 3rd through 8th grade assessment results from Forward and DLM, as well as 11th grade assessment results from ACT and DLM. There is growth that comes from student growth percentiles ranging from grade 4 through grade 8. There's graduation, which is the combination of the average of the 4-year and the 7-year graduation rates at the school. Chronic absenteeism, and then ELP progress, which is based on student growth percentiles on the access exam for ELs. And again, all these 5 indicators come together to produce those summary scores. I mentioned that schools get identified, and there's a process for exiting these identifications. For CSI and ATSI, which again occur every 3 years, there are 3 different types of criteria that a school must meet in order to exit. In the interest of time, I won't spend too much time reviewing them, but just kind of understand that the school needs to make sufficient academic progress regarding performance, but they also must demonstrate that they have systems in place to ensure that they'll be successful in the future. The third type of identification, TSI, these identifications do not have an exit process because it's an annual identification. And so essentially the way you exit TSI is to just not get identified again the next year. And now I'll pass things back to me to talk about IDEA.
Thanks, Patrick. So folks, what you'll notice as we go through the slides is that we've worked at the Department of Public Instruction to be able to align to the extent possible the way in which we talk about these 2 large federal programs and the required actions as a way of lifting that load off of the local education agencies. So just like Patrick described in ESSA, there ranges from a least severe to most severe identification under the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act with required actions. Again, all of the data is focused on students with disabilities or students who are served by an IEP. And so those categories would be needs assistance, needs intervention, and needs substantial intervention. And so we typically work with districts or work with charter schools in each of these categories on the areas or the required actions. So next slide, please. Just like under ESSA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act asks states to look at data from a broad range of sources and areas of focus to come up with the LEA determinations. And that reflects the policy purpose served that number one, there are a lot of requirements to attend to in order to ensure students with IEPs are receiving a free appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment as required by federal law, as well as the twin goal of IDEA, which is that we're improving outcomes for students with disabilities. So when we calculate the LEA determinations at the state level, we're looking at data like graduation, dropout, assessment, participation, and proficiency, and the educational environment where kids with IEPs are learning. And we also look at areas of compliance. So we look at when kids transition from county services to school district services, and timely initial evaluations, and post-secondary transition plans. We look at corrected non-compliance, and finally, timely and accurate data. And what you'll notice, or what I'll share with you, is that much of this data is pulled from WISEData, and mostly, actually all of the data on the results column is pulled from WISEData, and therefore addressing the ensuring that the data is valid and accurate and reliable during the data snapshots is really critical in terms of getting an accurate LEA determination. And also there are some standalone data collection applications that the special education team manages to get some of the additional data that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. So if you or your special ed director does not have access to the special education portal, that's something that you'll want to do sometime this summer before school starts. So next slide, please. For what we want to highlight is that all LEAs, all charter schools, are going to get what's called a joint federal notification report. The preliminary report is going to be released in February of 2024, and the final report is going to be released in April of 2024. Those are the new reports, which means there are current reports also in SAFE. So if you don't have a copy of your joint federal notification, you'll want to access that is current for this school year. You'll want to access that via SAFE, because you'll want to either know that you have an identification and thus some required actions, or you may want to use the data to drive continuous improvement at the school level. And in order to support you in that continuous improvement effort, if you go to the next slide, please, Alex, the Department of Public Instruction is committed to reducing the number of plans that, in particular, charter schools have to submit when they're identified for improvement. So instead of submitting a plan under ESSA and IDEA and having a separate school and district improvement plan, every year we work at the state level on the short list of charter schools that have shared identifications, and then reach out to the charter school to work with you to minimize the effort at the local level. Next slide, please. Whether your charter school is identified for improvement or not, you're absolutely welcome to engage in the free or low-cost supports that the Department of Public Instruction has invested in around improvement. So those are things like all schools can access the educator effectiveness, equitable multi-level systems of support, or instructional materials and professional learning supports that are offered through DPI. And certainly you're welcome to participate in the TA network for improvement or discretionary grants that are housed at the CISA level to support you in continuous improvement. And finally, there's a very specific discretionary grant that's targeted to charter schools and focused on students with IEPs, and that is managed by CISA 1, and Linda Baldus is the contact person. And finally, I just want to go over the key takeaways and flags for you all in terms of what needs to happen next, because I know that not only in this presentation, but also all morning and a little bit into this afternoon, you're going to get a whole lot of information that is important and useful and overwhelming at this point in mid-July. So Alex, next slide, please. The first thing I want to flag for folks is that as it relates to this idea of identifications and in particular required improvement activities under the two largest federal laws, again, that's ESSA and IDEA, one of the most critical things to pay attention to is the quality of data that's coming from the charter school to the Department of Public Instruction in large part through WISEData. So if your school hasn't gotten a WISE, if you're not a district administrator with access to WISE, please make sure that someone in your charter school is, and that someone in your charter school has wearing the special ed director hat, is accessing the special education portal, so that the data that's coming into the department is as accurate and reflective of what's happening in reality and on the ground of your schools as possible, so that when we crunch the data at the state level, we are making accurate, determinations based on your local data. So the December 5th data snapshot is something to pay close attention to. And in the slide, there's a link to more information about the data snapshot. Then the next thing to pay attention to is ensuring that you have access to the secure access file exchange. And again, the hyperlink on this slide gets you to where you can request access, and then invite you to review the joint federal notification packet. The preliminary one will come out in February for next year. If you don't have a copy of this year's, you'll want to go into SAFE and download that report. And then finally, invite all schools to access continuous improvement supports, and primarily again through either your local CISA or CISA 1 and the charter school grant that's housed out of CISA 1. So with that, I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions or connections or corrections as we wind up our presentation today. Feel free to raise your hand, turn on your camera, type it in chat or the Q&A.
Sounds like it's pretty clear to everybody.
Thanks for that feedback, Lois. I'm happy to stay on the call, and if any questions come up as folks are reflecting on Patrick's presentation and my presentation, you're welcome to chat or chat me directly or chat through to everyone. And before we transition to the next presentation, does that work for you, Alex?
Yeah, I think that's fine. Okay. Well, we're a little early. Let's see. Patti should be here in about 10 minutes. I don't think she's on the call now. That's okay. Okay, you know what? We're going to call an audible. And in anticipation of Helen Leong having some stuff to say to us at 2:15, I'm going to jump down for the next 9 minutes or so and talk a little bit about independent charter school basics. Does that work for everybody? I think no one's going to have any objections to that, right? So you're going to get a quick million-mile-an-hour preview of everyone else's slides, because this is the only way I know how to do it, because I was born in 1989 and I've stopped learning how to work the internet in 2013. So I'm just going to zoom all the way through it until we get to me. Here we are. Okay. Here's some independent charter school basics. So as you know, independent charter schools become their own LEA. That's why we're here. And chapters 115 to 121 of state law do not apply to charter schools unless explicitly provided. So that provides our charter schools a lot of flexibility under state law to do a lot of new and creative and innovative things for kids, which is really exciting. So one of the things that we've heard come up this year, and I want to sort of hit on because it was a point of confusion, is that there is a distinction between independent charter schools based on the authorizer that impact the source and method of the per pupil payment, but there's no difference between if you're a 2R or a 2X, if you're authorized by the OEO or the Waukesha County Executive or UW-Milwaukee, in the amount of money that comes through as a per pupil aid payment or your eligibility for categorical aids. So what does it mean to be an ICS? So you have statewide enrollment without the need for students to open enroll. One of the things that we can't require you to do, but I recommend that you do, is not refer to your enrollment period as open enrollment, because that confuses some folks and then they call up the open enrollment team and they're trying to figure out how they open enroll into your independent charter school. The beauty of it is that they don't have to open enroll. They can enroll if they live in Racine County into a school in the Kenosha School District because they're statewide enrollment. It cannot be a virtual school. So we can discuss sort of what it means to be a hybrid, but the long and the short of it is that there's a prohibition in statute for independent charter schools being a virtual charter school. That does not mean that you can't have a virtual class if, for example, there's a professor up at UW Superior who does a really nifty, waterways program that they can't provide some virtual instruction, but that would be hybrid. That would not be a virtual school. So another big important distinction we talked about earlier is that independent charter schools operate without district support. You don't have an education support center to do all this work for you. You're doing it all on your own, and that's really impressive, and it's also a big burden, and so that's why we're here to help. So what do we get paid per pupil? The independent charter school per pupil payment amount comes from a formula in statute, and you can see that statutory citation there. If you're a 2X, that's a OEO school, that formula is referenced back to the 2R. It's the exact same formula, and it's based on the adjustment to the revenue limit, if positive, the sum of these various changes to certain state categorical aids, and that list is in statute, if positive, and the sum of the amount paid the year prior. So all I have to say is if there's no change to the categorical aid, if there's no adjustment to the revenue limit, you will be paid the same amount as you were the year prior. So your payment will never be lower than what you've received the year prior. And this year, courtesy of the state legislature and Governor Evers, the payment amount has increased rather dramatically to $11,385. That is the per pupil payment amount for this year. Typically, we're able to calculate at that same time what the payment amount would be for 24-25. We're still working on those numbers, so you will get it before 24-25, I promise. But right now, just keep in mind $11,385. Okay, so what do we get paid for categorical aid? There's a link on this webpage that goes through all the different ones. Independent charter schools are eligible for some, but not all, state categorical aid, the big one that you are not eligible for is per pupil payment amount or per pupil categorical aid. And one of the reasons for that is that that goes to districts. It doesn't go to LEAs. And so everyone is eligible for the same categorical aids, and you have to proactively sort of, work to claim them. And so we've talked about what that looks like. So for the per pupil payment, what you're going to do, and this is touching on that question that was asked earlier, is your per pupil payment amount, as a lot of you know, but some of you may not know, is based on your preliminary membership count report, which is due at the beginning of September. It's due on September 1st, which is also the count date. So it's due that same day. Your third Friday in September count, which is based on the third Friday in September, second Friday in January, in the membership audit. There's a lot of data that we use that are hidden in columns that you can't see. It's on the spreadsheet that you submit to us. So it's really important that you do it on that spreadsheet. Don't look at that spreadsheet and say, man, this is a really monster of a spreadsheet. I think I can do this better for DPI and they're really going to appreciate it. I won't. And I will ask you to do it again. Those payment dates come 4 times a year: in September, based on your prelim; December, based on third Friday; February, based on second Friday; in June, based on your membership audit. And so the program calendar, which is going to come out this afternoon, or it's going to come out tomorrow, will give you those specific dates, and those will also be in the payment letter, which should come out next week. And then the other payments are based off of that data that gets pushed through WISE, like we've been talking about today. One of the things that I really want to impress upon you is that there is a tight turnaround for particularly that preliminary count report. And you're probably going to feel that because that date that you do it is the 1st of September. And then the date that you have to give it to me is the 1st of September. And that's because you're also getting paid like in September. So it's a really tight turnaround. So please do not dilly-dally with that report in particular. You're going to submit that pupil count report through Kiteworks. And the reason you're doing it through Kiteworks and not through email is because it contains personal identifying information for every single one of your students. It includes their grade, it includes their name, it includes where they're from. And so we do that through Kiteworks so it's secure and it's not just sitting in my inbox waiting for me to get fished. I've hit on this before. Please identify the correct resident district. It really is a burdensome time suck when there are corrections on the back end of it. We've gotten a lot of folks since I've started begging, shamelessly begging, who are like doing it perfect. And the Lincoln Academy is a great example of folks that have just knocked it out of the park. And so I know it is possible. If you sit down and you take the time to do it right, it is really going to save me so much time and effort on the back end to adjust those resident districts, because we do use them for title funding. Okay, so everyone at DPI is student driven. And so everyone that you're going to see today, everyone whose name is there is a great contact for you. But if you don't have a contact, please feel free, and I encourage you to contact me first. We talked about how you should have a board attorney. We, obviously keep your authorizer informed. It's great to see Nicole on here as an authorizer. I absolutely love that. I'm excited to work with you. So that's where we are, and I'll leave it there because Patty's on the call, and I'll zoom back up the million mile a minute in reverse to get to Patty's slides, and we'll get rocking and rolling again. Boop, boop, boop. Patty, are you able to have audio?
I am. Can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, perfect.
So I was killing time by pulling an audible, but we are back to your slides, and the way it works is that I'll click through so you could just focus on the talking. But if you need me to go ahead and jump to another slide, I'm pretty intuitive about it. Just give me a kick under the table, and I'll be sure to jump to the next one.
Sounds good. Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Patti Williams, and I'm the director of the special education team here at DPI. I've been in this position for less than a year, but I have been working in special education at the department for about 23 years now. So a long history primarily around monitoring and compliance. And some of the information that I will be sharing today is really about those requirements and really intro requirements about what's required under special education. So Alex, do you want to go to the next slide? So what we're going to be talking about, again, just as a brief overview, is about sort of the evaluation responsibilities, the responsibility of assuring that each student with a disability receives a free, appropriate public education, or what's called FAPE, and how you do that in part by developing and implementing an IEP. So what you want to do in terms of making sure that you have a vehicle that's designed to provide FAPE to that student. And then the last thing that I want to do is share with you some resources. And if I can leave here with nothing else, I want to make sure that you know where to go to get some more information about special education responsibilities and to help you that way. Also, if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask as I go through the presentation. And I don't know, Alex, if you could check chat, and if anything pops up, just let me know.
Sure. And Sarah, I think you can also help out with that,
Perfect.
since I can barely walk and chew gum at the same time.
All right, thank you. All right, so then the one thing I just want to always start out by saying that, you know, independent charter schools are exempt from the state law special education requirements, which is Chapter 115. However, they are still required to follow the regulations under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is a federal act, and accompanying regulations. Special education is a highly regulated area of law, and IDEA provides those regulations. So even though state law is exempt, there's very few things in state law that's not in federal law, and federal law is much more comprehensive than our state law. So for example, there's disciplinary requirements under IDEA that you don't find in our state law under Chapter 115. Rather, every district in Wisconsin follows those disciplinary requirements required under IDEA. And I'm talking about the special education disciplinary requirements. So and then the other thing, just to kind of just as a caveat, is, you know, students with disabilities can't be denied enrollment and can't be denied solely because of a need for special education or related services. So sometimes you hear, I think the term is coaching out, things like that for students with disabilities, but keep in mind that admission can't be denied because of their disability status. Okay, so the first thing to know as a LEA, because independent charter schools are considered LEAs, is that there are evaluation responsibilities. And this includes accepting special education referrals. So accepting a referral to determine whether or not a student with a disability. Anyone may make a referral. The referral has to be in writing. It needs to include the name of the child and why the person believes the child has a disability. And in many districts, school staff will assist parents in completing the forms, and you'll often see a referral come from a parent. Next slide. There are certain individuals that are required to make referrals. So those would be licensed school staff, physicians, nurses, psychologists, social workers. And then the other thing to remember is that if you are going to make, let's say a teacher is going to make a special education referral, you want to make sure that you let the parent know that you are going to make that referral. And then again, anybody else can make a referral, and that is often a parent that will make that referral. The other obligation that LEAs have with regard to, this child find referral process is, let's say a parent comes to you and says, I have concerns about my child because they're not, X, Y, and Z. You have an obligation to inform them about how to make a referral. So you'll want to explain that, they can make a special education referral, that it has to be in writing. This is the information that you want to include. So, that there's that obligation as well. So it's not only just accepting the written referrals, but actually letting parents know and others who are expressing concern about a student. There are certain evaluation process and timelines. So the first part of the process is review of existing data on the student by the IEP team. And what you're doing here is you're determining what data you have to conduct that that evaluation, and whether or not you need some additional assessments. Now, this doesn't have to be through an IEP team meeting. And often what is done is that IEP team members will be contacted for their input, and that will include the parent. So make sure that the parent is contacted, and there's that discussion about whether or not the parent thinks there needs to be some additional assessments. Once you've done that, and let's say you've determined that you do need to have additional assessments, then you have to have parental consent for conducting those assessments. So you're going to send a notice to the parent asking for consent for conducting that assessment. If it's an initial evaluation, so if this is the first time a child is being referred for special education, I mean, they're not a child with a disability, then the parent has to give explicit consent for conducting those assessments. If the child is already a child with a disability, you're doing a reevaluation, and you make multiple attempts to get that consent, but the parent just doesn't respond, then you can go forward. So that's a difference between an initial evaluation and a reevaluation. So then after you get that consent, then you can conduct your assessments, you gather the information, and then you have to meet to determine eligibility as an IEP team. You need to determine eligibility within 60 days from receiving that parental consent. So once you get 60 days, once you get that parental consent, then you want to start counting that 60 days and make sure that it's done within that time frame. Okay, the next one, these are the disability categories that that a student may be identified under as a area. The specific requirements under each of these areas are found in our administrative code, PI 11. But on our DPI website, you will also see criteria worksheets for each of these areas that will walk through it's sort of the analysis about whether or not that particular child meets this criteria area. So then the next slide. In determining whether a child is with a disability, it's really important that it is completed as a two-part test. So the first question is, does that child meet eligibility area, like I just showed you, one of those areas that adversely affects their education performance? So, do they meet one of those areas? Let's say it's determined that the child meets the disability category area of autism. But then the second question is, as a result of their disability, does the child need special education and related services? And that's really what triggers qualification under IDEA as a student with an IEP, is does that child need specially designed instruction? If they don't, then the child does not qualify under IDEA. It's a two-part analysis. So for example, you might have a child that is hearing impaired, and they qualify under that category, but they do not need specially designed instruction. They may need some supports, but they don't need that specially designed instruction. So It's always really important to keep in mind. Okay, next. But just to go back to that example, let's say you do have a child that doesn't need specially designed instruction, but they do need maybe some supports and accommodations, and they meet the definition of Section 504 eligibility, then that student might qualify under 504, and you'd want to develop a 504 plan for that student to provide some of those supports that you determined that that student needs because of their disability. So again, it's 504. And often it's the same evaluation process that's followed. So you can use the IDA evaluation process for determining 504 eligibility as well. But there's a little bit different definitions. So for a 504, the person is eligible if they have a physical or mental impairment, which substantially limits one or more major life activities, has a record of such impairment, or is regarded as having such impairment. And then there's a definition of what major life activities is. As you can see, it's quite broad. And so then if the student meets that definition and needs some supports, then you would develop that 504 plan. So then the other responsibility, and and I like to kind of walk through this in order. Let's say the child is a child eligible for an IEP under IDA. So then the next thing that LEA or independent charter school would be responsible for is developing an IEP that meets FAPE. And if the child's initially identified, you need to develop that IEP within 30 days of determination. But so you want to think about what that child needs based on the individual needs of that particular child that's going to allow them to make progress both in the general education curriculum and towards their IEP goals. And that's what you're going to think about. It has to be individualized. It can't be based on sort of the services that are available. It really, you have to think about what that child needs. So next slide. So FAPE is defined in IDEA as being provided under public expense, meeting the standards of the department in Part B of IDEA, and provided in conformity with an IEP. So that definition, other than the fact that it's got to be public, publicly paid for, things like that, it's not the most helpful. It has been further defined through case law. So if you turn to the next slide. There's two crucial cases, both decided by the U.S. Supreme Court as what FAPE has to do, what it means to provide FAPE. So Raleigh was our first case. That was in 1982. And Raleigh said that the IEP has to be reasonably calculated to enable the student to receive educational benefit. And what Raleigh said is that in most cases, that's going to be designing an IEP that allows a student to move from grade to grade. So be able to make progress in their grade and be able to move from grade to grade, making progress in accordance with the grade level standards. There was a lot of, I would say, I don't know if I want to say inconsistency, but there was different interpretations among the Court of Appeals, the Federal Court of Appeals, as to what was meant by educational benefit. And it really kind of came down to two sort of camps. One was, it was defined as sort of de minimis. So as long as it was more than nothing, you met that educational benefit standard. Others said it had to be meaningful. Other Court of Appeals said it had to be meaningful progress. So the US Supreme Court in 2017 decided to revisit this issue and issued another decision called Andrew F. That one really built upon Raleigh and further explained what's meant by educational benefit. And what the court said is that the IEP must be reasonably calculated to enable a student to make progress appropriate in light of the student's circumstances, Typically, that would be making progress so that they could progress grade level each year, but that might not always be the case based on the particular student. So that's what Andrew F. said. What they also said is that the IEP is the vehicle for providing FAPE. It has to be individualized, and that the goals must be both appropriate and ambitious. So they need to be ambitious, but they need to be achievable. And that was kind of the balance that the court struck. So, just kind of sum this all up in terms of your FAPE responsibility is that you have to provide a student with a disability FAPE through developing a program that's based on their unique needs, that's reasonably calculated to enable the student to make progress. And note that reasonably calculated language. It doesn't mean that it's a guarantee. An IEP is not a guarantee. And sometimes you'll hear that, like, from a particular parent that's frustrated. It's like, the IEP said the student would be able to do this. Well, it's not a guarantee, but it has to be calculated or reasonably calculated to enable that student to make progress that's appropriate in light of the student's circumstances, documenting that program in the IEP. So you want to have clear documentation, and you want to have an IEP that people can pick up and know what's supposed to be done, what the services are, and that's understandable by the entire IEP team, as well as anybody that might be implementing it. And then finally, you want to make sure that that program that's articulated in the IEP is implemented and those services are provided. So, this is just sort of the foundation and crucial part of IDEA is appropriately identifying students, and then once they're identifying, appropriately developing the IEP. All right. I talked about an IEP team. I just thought I would cover what's in federal law as who has to be on an IEP team. It would be the student's parents, at least one regular education teacher, at least one special education teacher, a representative of the independent charter school. And what's important about this representative is that they are able to commit resources. So who's ever serving on that IEP team, if there's a particular service, et cetera, that's needed, they are able to determine and make that commitment to provide that service. And then person able to interpret the instructional implications of evaluation results. Often that is, the special education teacher, the regular education teacher. It doesn't have to be a separate person. Others with knowledge of special expertise about the child. They can be determined either by the district or the parent, and it's at the discretion, so that if the parent wants to bring somebody that they believe has special expertise, they need to be allowed to do so. And then whenever appropriate, the student, should be a IEP team participant. They have to be invited if the purpose is to determine post-secondary goals and transition services. So if you're going to be talking about post-secondary transition plans, things like that, the student needs to be invited. For the IEP content, what we did through the I-4 form, and I have a link to our forms as well as the form guide at the end of this presentation, but we really wanted to make sure that as IEP teams go through the process of developing an IEP, that there's an understanding how each of the part is connected. So you begin by, talking about what the parents' concerns are, describing where the student is currently, both academically and functionally, and that's our present levels. And then from that information, you determine, so what is the effect of the disability? What is the effect of the student's disability on their ability to engage both in the regular education curriculum and towards their goals? So what is that effect? From then, what are their needs? So what does that student need in order to develop the skills, et cetera, that's going to allow them to make progress? And then the goals are based on those skills. So what skill does that student need to have develop so that they can have access to the general education curriculum and be able to make progress. We've spent a lot of time over the last few years really looking at goals, and in our monitoring process, which all independent charter schools are part of, we really look at the goals in an IEP. And what we're looking for is that there's a clear level of attainment. Where do you want that student to be in a year? There's a baseline. Where are they now? You want to make sure that those measurements match, so that if you're talking about percentages for the level of attainment, the baseline is measured also in percentages. There needs to be a method for measuring progress that's associated with that goal. So how is progress going to be measured? That then also has to match that baseline and level of attainment. So for each goal, we're looking for those things. Is it measurable? Do you have that level of attainment baseline? And is there a method for measuring that progress? What Andrew F. said by the Supreme Court that I think was really important for everybody in the field to understand is that if a student isn't making progress, you don't want to wait until the annual IEP team meeting to just kind of determine why it's not working, why the student isn't making progress, but you want to meet sooner. And so that's why it's so important that progress is being monitored and measured. And you know if a student just isn't making the kind of expected progress that you would hope the student to make. And then so that you can regroup and sort of figure out, does the student need some other services? Does the student need, some more supports in certain areas so that you can help that student continue to make progress? And then finally, in the IEP, you will have the services that the student needs. You'll have the specially designed instruction, because as I said earlier, you have to have specially designed instruction if the student is eligible for an IEP, what related services that student might need, and then what supplementary aids and services or program modifications that the student might need. So those are all part of that program services as well as summary. And next. I've been talking about special education. I just thought it would be helpful to put in the definition, but it's specially designed instruction, regardless of where it's conducted, that's provided at no cost to the child or the child's parents to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability. So I think based on kind of this very quick, brief overview of some of the key concepts for providing FAPE is that, IEPs have to be individualized. They have to be based on the student's unique needs. It has to be appropriately ambitious. And then it's reasonably calculated. So what you would expect the student to be able to accomplish in that year that you're developing the goals for. And then the thing to remember, I always say you can have the best written IEP, but if it's not implemented, it's not going to help. So there's a requirement that schools have an IEP in place for each student with a disability at the beginning of the school year, and that it has to be implemented as written. And, we get complaints around implementation. It's actually our number one issue that we receive complaints about as a department. And a lot of it stems from the fact that the IEP isn't written in a way that is understandable to all parties, and it's not understandable to those that are implementing. So there's some room for kind of interpretation, and it doesn't get implemented in the way that was intended by the IEP team. So I would encourage you, when you're thinking about writing those services and what the frequency and the amount is and the conditions under which it must be provided, that you really think about, can anybody picking up this IEP, they're going to know what we are intending for this particular service. So just encourage you to think about that. And then the other thing that's in IDA that, that there's a few special factors, but this one comes into play a lot when we're thinking about providing FAPE and meeting students' needs, and that's around behavior. And what IDEA requires is that if a student's behavior impedes his or her learning or the learning of others, the IEP team must consider the use of positive behavioral interventions and supports and other strategies to address that behavior. So what, goals, services, or supports are going to be in the IEP to address the student's behavior? And I will say, even though it says consider, in many cases where there's findings, it's because the IEP team, the student was struggling with behavior and it wasn't addressed through the IEP. That's one of the issues was that was in Andrew F. And that's in a lot of cases that you see. Because if you turn to the next slide, and this is coming from OSIP guidance, the Office of Special Education Programs to the U.S. Department of Education. But what OSIP has clearly said is that failure to address the behavioral needs of a student with disability can result both in the denial of FAPE, because the student isn't able to access instruction because their behavior is getting in the way, and can be a denial of placement in the least restrictive environment. So students have to be moved to a more restrictive environment because their behavior isn't being addressed. And then the other thing I just always encourage when you're thinking about addressing behavioral needs is to think about it as how they are addressed throughout the IEP, because sometimes you see it like stuck in a document that might be called the behavioral intervention plan. It's kind of put at the end of the IEP, but there are no goals or there are no services that are helping that student address what they need with regard to their behavioral needs. So really think about it broadly throughout the IEP. Does a student need a goal? Are there some related services that can be provided, such as counseling, et cetera, like that might help that student and address their needs? So again, just wanted to share those thoughts. And then the next slide. So these are some of the resources, and there are links that I put in. So I have the link to all of our IEP forms. I'm assuming that many of you will be using vendors, so you'll get your forms through that, but that is our form. There's also a link to the forms guide. So for each of the forms, there in the guide is a discussion about the purpose of that section, what needs to be completed in order to meet the federal requirements, and more information about sort of how to complete that particular IEP form. And then we also have model policies and procedures, and we have model policies and procedures that are developed for independent charter schools. So you'll see it if you click on that link, it will be independent charter school policies and procedures. And the reason why we did that is because we removed all the state law requirements, and it's just those federal requirements in terms of the model policies and procedures. And then, I just briefly touched on sort of kind of the key parts of the IEP and how they're linked together. But the CCR IEP framework and resources that has, each part of what I talked about, developing goals, measuring progress, determining present levels, is embedded in this framework. And there's webinars, there's modules, there's all kinds of resources. So I really encourage you to take a look at that. And go through that, because I think, and I may be a little biased, but I think it's some of the best training on developing IEPs through the CCR IEP framework. And then I think there's one more slide on resources. I also wanted to point out that CESA 1, so we have a discretionary grant with CESA 1, and it's titled the Special Education Capacity Building Initiative. This is for independent charter schools. So this is designed to provide you with the support you need to address these requirements under special education law. So they have a link to CESA 1. It has the contact information, but it focuses on compliance, programming, data collection and reporting, and then the fiscal management. So all those key areas that you need for special education compliance. So I really strongly encourage you to use these resources that CESA 1 provides. make those connections. And Linda Baldus is sort of the person that has been kind of leading this work with CISA 1. But connect with her and make sure that you get all the support you can from this grant. The other thing I wanted to mention is that they are also part of this induction program that we have a discretionary grant with right now. It's for new special education teachers or recent special education teachers. It provides some training, support, and coaching. They still have openings left or openings available. So if you know of somebody or if you would like some of your teachers to be involved with this, I strongly encourage you to contact Carrie Olson, who is, or Kari Olson, whose contact information is on that link. And she can let you know about the induction program. But she just wanted me to make sure that I mentioned that to you as well today. And I did outline some of the resources that they have. And again, if I leave here with nothing else, the last two slides are really important to take advantage of as you move forward with special education.
Patti, there's a question in the chat from Central Sands, and I'll read it for posterity for the video recording. Can an ICS elect not to use a software vendor for SPED record keeping if they utilize the DPI's IEP forms and securely store them internally?
Yes, so you're not required to use a vendor. I know that there's many things a vendor provides that I think most districts do use a vendor, but you can use our model forms as IEP forms.
Okay, are there any other questions for Patti while we have her here? Oh, let's see, something popped up in the chat. That's just a thank you. Yeah, and I echo that. Thank you, Patti, for taking the time and chatting with us. It sure does mean a lot.
Oh, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now. So I'm going to, well, Britt, do you want me to keep sharing my screen or do you want to take over the screen sharing?
I'll probably just take over. It'll be easier for me.
Okay, then I'm going to stop.
Kind of transition where I'm going.
And you should
Okay, so let me just get what I need. Yeah, and thank you everyone for letting me join you today. I am just hopefully gonna share this window and then I'm going to put my presentation on and hopefully you can see my slides. Oh, and of course that silly little, there we go. Okay, perfect. Sometimes the name information doesn't want to let me go to the next slide as it's continuing to blink. Okay, so everyone can hopefully see my WISE reporting slide.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you for letting me join you today. My name is Britt Mueller. I am the WISE relationship manager on our customer service team. And today I'm going to go through with you some WISE basics and WISE data portal navigation for those of you that are on the call and maybe new to WISE reporting or just want a refresh. So first and foremost, I want to talk about requesting WISE access. So you are going to need to request access to a number of applications to be able to access the data reporting process flow and everything that entails. So to access any WISE application, including WISEData and also a number of other applications, I came in after the special education team. So if you are responsible for assisting with special education reporting, there may be additional user roles and applications for you to request as well. But essentially, you're going to need either a Google Enterprise account or a WAMS ID. The Google Enterprise account would be a local decision through your school. That would be however it was configured. If you don't have Google, this option most likely is unfortunately not available to you. But I just wanted to mention the two different formats in case you wanted to utilize either of those. So when you create a WAMS ID, make sure you're using your school email address, as this helps with data privacy and school security in the event that you ever leave your school. So many of you, especially if you are educators, may have a personal WAMS account that you have tied to your licensing information. That's not the WAMS account we want to use for your application access. We want to get your school recognized email address and link that in. So you may have to create a new WAMS account in the event of that. So that can be found on the link right there. The first bullet point, or sorry, the second bullet point says WISE Home. That will have the WISE Home link, which I'm going to show you in just a minute, along with instructions on how to request a user role. When you request access to a user role, that is actually granted at the local level by your application administrator or your district security administrator, which we refer to as your DSA. So when you request a new application access, that goes locally. So you may, sorry, got some dings. So you may need to figure out who your application admin is so that you can ensure that you have the access you need. And then I also included a link at the bottom about the different user roles that are available to you. Again, there are a number of different applications that you can access. There are a number of different user roles that are available to you. So make sure that you're taking a look at that list to get the appropriate one requested. Now, the three that I'm going to specifically advise that you have access to are the three on the screen: WISE ID, WISE Data Portal, and WISE for districts. These are the three that are going to be useful to you with your data reporting, review, and processing. So these are the three that I would say at minimum you should have as important to your role. Basically, WISEData allows you as a school to send data to the state from your student system, and the goal of WISEData is to make that process as easy as possible for you. So we house a number of different data elements, such as enrollment, special education, discipline, etc. The data is reported to WISEData by linking itself to a student WISE ID. This is a unique identifier assigned to each student that follows them through their K-12 education in Wisconsin. So we always want to make sure that students are appropriately linked to the correct WISE ID for them. And using that link, that is how you are going to send all of your information to WISEData. Now, this is the data submission process. So we have you at the LEA doing your data entry in your student information system. That gets sent to the WISEData portal, where it goes through our validation review. And I'm going to show you a little bit about that once I start the demo. But here's a bit more of a visual representation of that. So again, we have you at the LEA. You collect the student information. The next step is you enter it into your student information system, your SIS vendor. Once it's in the vendor tool, you will push it to WISEData. It will go through our validation review process. If there are any issues, we will notify you with an error or a warning, and any errors and warnings need to be corrected back in your student information system and then resynced and validated to ensure that they can get to the next step, which is WISE for districts, or what we call our data warehouse. The important thing to note about WISE for districts is that this is actually where your snapshot information and your report card information is pulled from. So even though I'm going to focus mostly on the WISEData portal application today, the WISE for districts one is equally as important. And so if you would like to request a one-on-one training for that, or a review of any kind, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to walk through that with you. Just because of our time limit today, I can't get into it too much because there's a lot of information. But WISE for districts is where your snapshot and your report card information is pulled from, and that's where the data is actually pulled for public reporting. So important part of the process, but here's a visualization in case that is helpful for you.
Real quick, Britt, I don't know if everyone can see the flow chart that you have on your slides.
Oh,
For me,
okay.
all I can see is the WISE portal.
Oh my gosh, is this not showing my screen? I just went through a number of slides, so if that's not what you're seeing, that's unfortunate. Oh no, okay. I am really sorry. So the good news is all of the slides are in the presentation that Alex can share with you all, or I can share with you my presentation. Most of what I'm going to show you is in the WISEData portal anyway, so I do apologize for that. I thought I had this figured out, but I am not very familiar with Zoom, so maybe I was sharing incorrectly. So really sorry about that. They are all available to you in the slide deck. So if you have any questions, just let me know, and I apologize for that. So you can see my WISEData portal screen though, right?
Yeah, we can see you moving around there.
Okay, great. Well, then I'm just going to jump right ahead and go right into the demo where I was going to do most of my stuff anyway. So yeah, it's sorry about that, but we will just dive right in here. So when you log into WISEData portal, this is going to be your landing page. This is what we call our data quality page. There are a number of filters up here that are going to mostly follow you along in all of the different pages we're going to go over today. But this page is really meant as a at a glance review for you to take a look and make sure that the data, the health of your data is what you expect it to be. So we've got validation message summary here. Again, this is just going to give you total numbers of what we're going to look at on this tab. So I won't get too into it, but it's really just meant for you to kind of have a quick visualization of what's going on with your data. Below here, we have some data quality indicators. Again, these are just a visual representation of what your data is looking like. So as an example, if you are looking at this enrollment current and you notice that there are no students reported for 6th grade, but you know you have 6th graders to report, this is a really quick way for you to visually check out and say, okay, I'm missing a bar graph here. Something is going on with my 6th grade class. I need to investigate that further. There are a number of different filters in here that you can use as well. Just depends on how you want to use this information. And I do want to make a quick note. The difference between these two, as you'll see, they're both called enrollment, but this is enrollment current and this is enrollment count date. If we look at the enrollment count date, we can see it's set for the 3rd Friday of September. So this is what your enrollments looked like on the 3rd Friday of September. I can see down at the bottom, I had 9 students reported, okay? If that sounds accurate for my TFS count, great. My current enrollment, however, has 12 students. So if you can verify, or if it makes sense for you to say, yes, I had 3 students transfer into our school after the 3rd Friday of September, great, this looks accurate, we're good to go. But if these numbers are supposed to match and they're not, again, it's just another reminder for you that there's something going on that we need to dig a little bit deeper into. And then we also have an attendance and a discipline one. These are a bit more specific, so I won't get too into those because they tend to be very specific to certain scenarios. And this is fake information, so they don't really make a ton of sense in these examples anyway. Okay, so the next page we're going to look at is the validation message page. This is where you are going to spend majority of your time in the WISEData portal. Now, when we talk about you enter the information in your student information system and you push it or resync it or publish it, whatever verbiage your vendor uses, you are going to send the data to the WISEData portal and it's going to go through our validation logic. Once it's validated, these are the things you're going to see on this list, okay? So this is the validation message list, and there are 3 different ones to be aware of. We have the red exclamation mark. These are the critical errors. This is the error that is going to impact your data the most when it comes to that second step that we talked about, the data warehouse, where the snapshot and the report cards are pulled from. This critical error is basically saying whatever you're submitting for this data value is not going to go any further. It is having a full stop right here. So these are really important and high priority for following up with and making sure that you resolve them. The next one is a red X. This is also an error, but it's not quite as severe as the critical. This is telling you you have submitted a value or you are missing a value that we would expect. And so we may let some of the information you're submitting go through to the data warehouse, but it won't be correct and it's not going to be completely reported the way that you want it to. So again, very important to take a look at these, make sure you're monitoring and you're checking these out and you're making any fixes that you need to in your student information system and sending those back over. And then lastly, we have the yellow triangle, which is a warning. Now, these are also important to review, but essentially what a warning is it's telling you you've submitted your data in a way that we would not expect it to be reported. Please review for accuracy. So these are going to allow the data you've submitted to go through to data warehouse. They're not going to have any big negative impact on your data as it's reported. They're just things that we want to bring to your attention and say, hey, do you mind taking a second look? Because we're not sure if this is correct or not. So those are the 3 different validation message types. Now let's take a look at one of them. Let's say we want to take a look at, let me pick an easy one. Okay, required field is missing exit date. Okay, what exactly does that mean? I have this error message. What is it actually telling me? What you can do is you can click this blue button right next to it, and it's going to open up what we call a KBA, or a knowledge base article. This is going to give you a bit more information. So it's going to tell you what the short text of the error was. That's the one you most likely see in WISEData. It's going to give you a longer text to provide a little bit more information. Most of them have the business rule impact, just to kind of give you a little bit more technical on like what exact values we're looking at. And then we have a how to fix. I do want to make a quick clarification that our how to fix is meant to be helpful, but it may not always be helpful. Because we work with a number of different student information system vendors, we unfortunately cannot get very specific in the instructions for how to fix. So I know sometimes these can be a little frustrating when you're like, yes, I understand this is very, very simple information, but how do I actually resolve it? That would be a time when it would be beneficial for you to go to your vendor support tools and figure out if they have any additional information or documentation to assist with this particular validation error. But I just want to make that clear, because again, we do work with a number of different vendors, so we can't always tell you that this ties to this specific field in this vendor and this is what we're looking for. But additionally, we also try to provide examples. So we have District Deb here, and this is meant to just be a real world example to kind of give you a little bit more context of like, if this was happening at your school, here's kind of the scenario that we imagine would be happening, and here's the response that District Deb has to try to resolve this. So KBAs are really meant to be helpful for you. If you have additional feedback, feel free to send us any of that to help clarify, but that's really the purpose behind this blue hyperlink here. So please use it to your advantage. Okay, so now we have our error message. I know what I need to do with it, but who exactly am I looking at? Well, I can see over here, I have this number 12 and it's a total. What that means is that there are 12 students that fall under this error. So to see that list of students, I'm going to go all the way to the left and I'm going to click the little triangle here and it's going to give me that list of students. This is the way for you to see what's been submitted and break down the specific students that need to be taken a second look at. I'm going to look at this first student here, Clayton. It's going to give me all of his relevant information. I'm going to go all the way here to the right and click details. And this is going to pull up Clayton's student profile page. This has all of the information that you have submitted to us from your student information system for this particular student. Now, looking at this, you can see there's a number of different kind of data area topics that we're working with. And you can see these little yellow envelopes. These little yellow envelopes are an indication that there's a validation message that needs to be addressed. So I can see under the enrollment area, I've got the enrollment here. If I open this up with that little triangle again, I can see there are a number of validation messages going on with Clayton. So Clayton's going to need some work, right? You want to try to figure out what's going on with Clayton. Here's what WISEData is telling you is missing or is misreported. So the intention is that you can say missing field requirement exit date. Okay, I can see it in my enrollment record. There is no exit date for Clayton. I'm going to go back to my student information system. I'm going to look up Clayton. I'm going to go to his enrollment record and I'm going to say, is there a date reported? If not, I'm going to enter one and I'm going to send that to WISEData. Great. That's the intention behind these validation messages. Some of them might take a little bit more investigation. So we might say invalid expected transfer agency. Well, what exactly does that mean? I got to look down here a little bit, expected transfer agency, and it tells me what your system is reporting to us. And for whatever reason, Rural Virtual Academy most likely is not a school within this agency. So we're going to flag the error to let you know. So those are the kind of things that the validation messages are meant to assist you with when you're doing your data review. Now, let's say that you see this missing exit date. You go to Clayton in your student information system. You enter the exit date and you push that off to WISEData. Perfect. The next step to get him off of this list here is you're going to come up and click Q import and validate. This is going to take what you have resubmitted to WISEData and run it through that validation process again. Once this is complete, hopefully Clayton will no longer be on this list and this number will go from a 12 to an 11, and that lets you know that the issue has been resolved and you can move on to other things. I will say the Q import and validate process sometimes takes 10 minutes, sometimes it can take 2 hours. It really just depends on how many other schools are working on cleaning up their data, how many other schools are processing and pushing validations through. So I highly recommend you use this button here, this notify me when validation is complete. This just is going to send you an email to your email, your personal email that's here, and it'll let you know when the validation process is complete. So you're not having to sit in here and kind of refresh this page over and over. It'll just let you know when the process is done. So you can kind of do something else until this is complete, and then you're not really wasting any time waiting for it on your own time. So that is the validation messages screen. The next one is student search, pretty self-explanatory. This is going to have a list of all of your enrolled students. It's going to show you all of their personal information along with any errors or warnings that they have attached to them. If you click this details, it'll take you to that particular student's profile again, which I just showed you with Clayton. You can also use these search features up here if you had a particular student you wanted to find quickly as well. School roster details. This is going to be your course information. So any course information that you submit to WISEData is going to show here for your convenience. Fortunately, this is a site, so there's no course information in here for me to show you, but essentially you would just see line items the way you did on the student search that's going to say the specific course, local course code, local title, is it a CTE course, all of that good information for you to review. If you do have any errors or warnings connected to any of these courses, a common one that we see is maybe you've rolled over your course schedule and you have a class that's no longer being used in a current year, but it's still showing up in WISEData. We might flag that as saying you have this course reported with 0 students attached. That would also show in this area with the little yellow envelope, but it'll also show in the validation messages screen. So you don't need to always be checking this. If there's an issue, it'll notify you in the validation messages as well. Graduation plan. If you are a school that provides 12th grade as a school that you provide service for, you are going to be required to submit a graduation plan. This is going to come from your student information system. So just be aware of that. If you are a school that provides 12th grade, you are going to need to submit that. That is a requirement for the snapshot. Exports. This is going to be the second most used page. So make sure you're kind of paying attention to this. This is a really easy way for you to download a spreadsheet of your student information. So let's say that you're in WISEData and you want to look at all of the students that are going to be included in your third Friday count. You can download this spreadsheet and then be able to filter to ensure that all the students are being captured as present or absent correctly. If you're unsure about any of these spreadsheets and what exactly is entailed in all of them, we do have this little definitions button here. This is going to open up and let you know what each each column within that spreadsheet is intended for use. So that's something that we got from user feedback and hopefully you find useful as well. Quick note, there are 2 pages of exports for you. And it's really important that you are aware of the second page because this is where we have all of the validation message exports. So if you have a bunch of validation messages and you want to pull them out of WISEData for easier review, you can download them here. Or let's say you are someone that only works with the special education information. You only want to be able to review the special education validation messages. We have an export for that. It's only going to include the ones that are in that collection, and that's easier for you than having to kind of filter through all the other ones that may not actually have anything to do with your responsibilities or tasks. I'm going to touch really quickly on vendor resources. If you have a vendor tool that has provided us additional documentation, we have put it in this vendor resources area. So I mentioned earlier that because there are so many different student information system vendors, we aren't always able to give you the most helpful feedback for how to resolve certain issues with your data. But the idea, though, is that because you are a user of that vendor, they have provided us with certain documentation that we can link here, and then you can click it and it will take you to that documentation with a login process that you have already established with them. So this is a really great tool for you to kind of check in. I'm not sure how many vendors are provided how much information, so I don't know if it's going to be completely helpful, but it's something that you can definitely advocate with your vendor if you think it would be very beneficial to have a document in here that says exactly how to clean up some of those pertinent errors that you're seeing. And lastly, I just want to touch briefly on the homepage here. So this is going to show you your data flow. So from your student information system to the WISEData portal. Now, for those of you that maybe are new schools this year, this is the first time you're going to be using WISEData portal. You're going to have to set up those vendor connections. If you are in the WISEData portal and you see something that has your vendor's name but says no data received, that's an indication that the connection isn't quite there yet, and we need to take care of that as soon as possible. So if you are ever in here and it says no data received for a vendor tool that you are actively working in, that's going to be something we need to fix. And so this is kind of a way for you to be aware of that instead of being caught off guard on the validation messages when all of these messages aren't making sense. An additional use would be if this was your vendor and you see this date at the bottom. This says 7/17. Great. That lets me know that the last time this vendor tool pushed information to WISEData was 3 days ago. However, if I was in my vendor tool yesterday trying to clean up information that I saw validation messages for, and I thought that that data was being updated, this date lets me know that what I did on 7/19 isn't quite making it to WISEData. So again, it's kind of just an informational visual for you to be aware of, is your data flowing? Is there an issue we need to address? Type of situation. And then last thing, you're most likely not going to see this orange banner currently right now if you're logging into WISEData. This is pertinent only to the snapshot timeframes. And so when you do see this orange banner, just make sure you're paying attention to it. It's going to give you some high-level data alerts along with some data outreach that customer service team does to ensure that your data is being reviewed and that you're not going to run into any big issues when that snapshot actually happens. And I just realized that I keep saying the word snapshot, and I'm not sure if you guys know what that means because it was part of my slides and they're not showing up right now. So the snapshot is basically when we take a picture of what your data looks like. Even though WISEData portal is continuously collecting information from you, we have to take a picture of that data at a certain point in time so that we can use it for public reporting and for the report cards. We talk about the third Friday of September as our big count inclusion date, which it is, but the data for the third Friday of September is not actually collected until our December snapshot. So prior to the December snapshot, we do a lot of outreach. We make sure that you are aware of how your data is looking. We want you to pay attention to those validation messages in the WISEData portal. But that December date is when that picture is going to be happening. And then once that happens, your information can no longer be updated or corrected after the fact. So I apologize, this was all over the place. Hopefully when you review my slides, when you get the presentation, it will make a little bit more sense what I was saying. I apologize that my screen share was not working in the way that I was hoping it was. But if you do have any questions along the way with WISEData portal, there are submit a help ticket buttons on majority of our WISEData web pages. You can also reach out to me directly. Most of you, I think, will have my email from prior communications, or you can get in touch with Alex and he can forward you on to me as well. And I think that's my time. I apologize again. It's a lot of information to run through, but I want to be respectful of your lunch hour. So don't hesitate to reach out if you have any additional questions along the way. And thanks for having me.
Thank you, Britt. Okay.